Going to the doctor. As we know, humor doesn't always travel. What makes the Russian roar with laughter leaves the Somali stony-faced, and vice versa. But some jokes manage to waltz over national boundaries. A man calls the doctor. "Doctor, what should I do? My friend just keeled over and died." "The first thing is to make sure he's definitely dead." "Okay, hold on." A gunshot sounds. Now what?" It may not be as surreally funny as the joke depicted in Monty Python, which, because it made people die from laughing, was deployed by the army. But in a study of gags with universal appeal, this came top. The sense of helplessness in an emergency, the miscommunication between doctor and caller, its tragic consequences, and the eager ingenuousness of the final question. The joke arranges them all to provoke in its audience an emotion that is simultaneously unbearable and exquisite. Among doctor jokes, this is a peach. But why so many more jokes about doctors than vets, say, or gardeners? We tend to joke about things that make us nervous, and in the case of doctors, what makes us nervous is probably their authority. As the great critic Maurice Blachot writes in an extraordinary story about being in hospital, "I liked the doctors quite well. The annoying thing was that their authority loomed larger by the hour. One is not aware of it, but these men are kings." From the moment we address her or him, we're aware of the doctor's authority. Just to enunciate the word doctor, a title and not a name, is to put us on unequal terms. Whatever the ailment is, it is to the doctor we go, because the doctor possesses the expertise we lack. And for all the efforts to modernize healthcare, whereby patient becomes customer and supposedly gains the upper hand, the disparity prevails. The doctor promises at least an insight into our condition, at most a cure, and the expectation thus created can hardly fail to give her the authoritative edge. Add the fact that that very condition puts us in the weaker position, and you can see why we're at our mercy. Small wonder that the profession suffers from a malady of its own, an overweening arrogance known as God syndrome. The divine authority of the doctor draws from two sources, in fact, not just her expertise. The flip side of the doctor's insight is the patient's blindness. Without our own uncertainty as patients about our condition, that authority would be halved. You could object that since the unofficial practice of Googling your symptoms began, and the official one of being encouraged to self-diagnose, we know more than ever about the inner workings of our body, and we're likely to arrive in the waiting room with as much data as the doctor herself. Indeed, so much so that we are developing into just the expert patient that in the interests of devolving responsibility, health services want us to become. But no matter the depth of our private investigations, it is to the doc we turn to make the final judgment, and we do so not just because the office of doctor alone can pronounce on our physical fate, but also because, beyond a certain vanishing point, we're as incapable of appraising our own condition as we are of looking between our shoulder blades. Even if the thing is as visible to the naked eye as a rash, a gash, or a bunion, our personal assessment is never quite enough. We feel it must be ratified. Allowing the accomplished doctor to throw our own analysis so suavely into relief, therefore, does two things. It reinforces her authority, for sure, but in doing so, it defines the limit of our own, and suggests that without a third party, we cannot see ourselves clearly. Some, like the Austrian philosopher Ivan Illich, have gone further and spoken of iatrogenesis, the phenomenon by which we're convinced of the need to take unnecessary medicines and become sicker as a result. For by giving so much authority over to the doctor, you ask yourself to be medicated as much as possible, in a process that exploits the incomplete self-knowledge we began with. And as you let the doctor insert the syringe in your ear or examine your vertebrae, you might reflect on how odd this is, the fact that we need an extra pair of eyes to be able to see ourselves. If you accept that the body is not just the vehicle of the self, legs to bear us, arms to reach what we need, but its very substance, such that along with the mind, the body constitutes the self that each of us is. Our not being able without help to see properly into the body means we can't see properly into ourselves. There's a part that will always elude us, a shadow that will fall across the otherwise transparent relationship each self enjoys with itself. While an appointment with a doctor illuminates our condition, the fact that we need to consult her in the first place confirms that when it comes to what we know about ourselves, we live in a state of partial eclipse. This is not necessarily a bad thing. If we could see all of ourselves all of the time, we might become as trapped in our bodies as hypochondriacs. A bit of self-unawareness probably allows us to go boldly into the world. But other than this partial invisibility to ourselves is the invisibility of the illness itself. In a book that combines literature, psychology, and medicine called The Body in Pain, leading American academic Elaine Scully goes some way towards scoping out such invisibility. When one hears about another person's physical pain, the events happening within the interior of that person's body may seem to have the remote character of some deep subterranean fact, belonging to an invisible geography that, however portentous, has no reality because it has not yet manifested itself on the visible surface of the earth. Even if we have high levels of empathy, the other person's pain can't help but seem as abstract as the suffering we watch on TV, the way we become desensitized over time to images of flood victims, for example, and its abstraction, an invisibility or incomprehensibility that applies as much to ourselves when we are in pain or suffering with an illness. Say, for example, the doctor makes the assessment that confirms or counters your own, bolsters her authority, and duly sends you away. If not quite an open book to yourself, at least more enlightened than when you arrived. Say that in doing so, she'll have drawn from a battery of scientific apparatus available to the modern medic: lasers, scanners, DNA sampling, probes, microcameras, computer analysis, 3D imaging, databases, robots, and pinpointed the very bacterium that's invaded you, the individual cell that's been corrupted, the particular chromosome that's lacking. Say finally that she's gone on to state the name: astigmatism, bradycardia, toxoplasmosis, melanoma, hepatitis. That sums the illness up. All well and good. If not yet physically contained by treatment, that illness has, by diagnosis, been rationally boxed off. Once an obscure threat, it has been translated into an object of science, where knowledge itself can bring some relief. But what if this scientific description misses something? What if what makes us ill in illness is precisely what is non-scientific, non-technical, or non-rational, and cannot be so described? What if illness is the opposite of science? It is perhaps a strange thought that illness isn't scientific, because our custom of describing illness in scientific terms has entrenched itself so much that we've largely forgotten that diabetes or glaucoma is not in itself a scientific, but a natural phenomenon. And when we don't use scientific terms, we use military ones. Particularly in the case of viruses and cancers, we personify them as if they were a clever, cunning, calculating enemy. Of a cancer, we might say that it thinks it's got to reproduce. Of a virus, that it's attacking the spinal cord. And of loved ones, that they are fighting an infection. Scientific or military or both, the language we use for illness creates the sense of a rational intelligence at large. But in those very metaphors is the hint of a quite different character. For example, the guerrilla features of the virus that lies dormant before springing up at random point towards a force that is subversive, insurgent, and violent. They suggest, rightly, that while illness is capable of being described in rational terms, reason is not its true mode. Why is that? Well, it might be rational for a tapeworm, say, to take up residence in the bowel, because as a parasite it has to live off others. We will fall ill not because of the tapeworm's behavior per se, which is rational indeed, but because, when set amidst our own vital needs, that behavior does us harm. The condition of badness, feeling ill, goes beyond the reasons that caused it. In other words, certain things led up to your falling sick. You picked up the parasite from undercooked meat, say. But the experience of illness puts you in a state that's now not about those causes, but about being sick in its own right. In going beyond its causes, illness passes through the night of reason. The doctor briefly shines her torch on it, and back once more into the dark. This nocturnal character of illness appears or disappears most dramatically in a famous poem by William Blake concerning the rose made sick by a worm of its own. O rose, thou art sick, the invisible worm that flies in the night in the howling storm, has found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love doth thy life destroy. Ostensibly, the sick rose is about a canker that affects roses. Allegorically, it's about the sickness of human love, and with strong sexual imagery to thicken it. It's contrary, of course, to think of love not as what cures, but as what kills, a marauding illness that darkens the door. Having said that, there is a long tradition that portrays love as an affliction, an infirmity which, in love-sickness, even has a name of its own, referring to the daydreaming, the loss of appetite, the suspension of your rational faculties that occur when you're in love. And if love is a kind of illness, illness is a kind of love, on the grounds that it flies in the night, unpredictable and blind like the winged Cupid, or a contagion you can't see coming. It gets under your skin and acts itself out in such fevered private rooms as lovers occupy. And, as in love, this essentially febrile aspect of illness can make your mind lose its bearings and wander, if not always to hallucinate, then perchance to dream or fantasize, to pass into the realm of the imagination. This propensity of illness to express itself in metaphor or imagery is most famously analyzed in a book I'll describe in a moment by Elaine Scarry's U.S. contemporary, the late Susan Sontag. But first, the most astonishing piece of radio I ever heard. A child psychiatrist was describing a little boy she treated. What was the presenting symptom? Quite suddenly, at the age of 4, the boy's personality changed. Where he had been bright, outgoing, lively, and curious, overnight he became withdrawn, morose, and uncommunicative. This had gone on for months. Previously, the boy's parents had enlisted the help of various medical professionals, but without joy. Now, psychiatrist and boy had the following exchange. What do you think is wrong with you? Silence. Would you like to tell me what you think it is? I can't. But you can if you like. I won't be angry. You haven't got enough paper. The psychiatrist looks quizzical. I've got plenty of paper. Look, how much would you like? And I have all these crayons too. Would you like to draw something? The little boy takes a piece of paper and draws a line from top to bottom. Then he takes a second piece and does the same. He puts the two together so that the line continues from one sheet to the next. He takes a third sheet, draws a third line, adds it onto the end of the line on the first two, and so on. The boy keeps going until the paper has run out, and the floor of the therapist's room is traversed by an uninterrupted line in crayon. It was then that I knew, said the psychiatrist on air, that the poor little boy had a tapeworm. In the psychiatrist's anecdote, the illness exploits the boy's faculties in order to appear semi-mystically and imagery, almost as if that boy were the earthly secretary of an unearthly demon, the mouthpiece of the illness. Even if you don't connect with the somewhat supernatural feelings of the story, it gets at the sensation we often have when we're fed up of hosting an illness that's passing through us, becoming its randomly chosen vehicle. But what Susan Sontag argues in Illness as Metaphor is that typically we construe things the other way round. We consider the illness an expression of a person. You are what you get ill from. Rather than addressing illness as a purely physiological phenomenon to be accounted for wholly in terms of etiology or epidemiology, we entertain all sorts of personality-driven associations between sickness and sufferer that reflect poorly on the latter. That might explain why, when you show up at the doctor's, a part of you will worry that you'll not just assess your symptoms, but from them make inferences about your character. Having bad circulation means you're a cold fish, for example, deficient in human warmth. Getting cancer means you are always eaten up inside, and that which has been repressed gets expressed at last in the cruelest fashion. Like it or not, your illness tells on you, and we listen to it without knowing it, like people stuck in the 16th century who in the theory of the humors had a prototype version. If, say, your spleen had an excess of black bile, you were a melancholic, the word to convey your character as much as your condition. The message is that if you really want to know who someone is, look not into their eyes, but into their medical records. Once you learn that Sontag's book was drafted during the first wave of AIDS and reprinted as AIDS and its metaphors, it's not so surprising that she stresses those associative qualities of illness. AIDS was the gay disease, which gave the moral majority an excuse to preach the downfall of Sodom. It both exposed the promiscuous character of those contracting it and punished them in kind. Nor should we forget the unfathomable, almost mythical inscrutability of AIDS in those early days, as it swept like Blake's invisible worm out of the dark continent into the West. Simply not enough was known about it to neutralize the images it spawned. Nowadays, of course, far more is known, just as far more is known about every disease under the sun. And that expansion in knowledge has produced, one hopes, less reliance on the metaphors Sontag deplored, which were as spiteful as they were specious. Even if a tacit and benevolent law has decreed that there must always be more disease than cure, the conquest of scientific fact over illness as mystery continues without impediment, and so your hopes for recovery are never misplaced. Yet, this character-based connection between pain and patient has in the meantime found other lodgings. Even as mainstream medicine surges ahead, it sees itself matched at a distance by the alternative medicine that is its bane, and that reasserts the link not just between different parts of the body, but between body and mind, and therefore between suffering and self. When you visit a homeopath, for example, you're very much taking your own whole being on, not just pointing at where it hurts, as you would with a regular medic who's been educated, like a philosopher who believes in the dualism of the body and mind, to separate mental and physical data. It's precisely in the face of such clinical purity that the alternative, holistic tradition believes body and mind intertwine to form a network of neural and mental pathways. Instead of being dragged down by the body, the mind unites with it, and together they project a whole that is more advanced than, on its own, either one could ever be. The presumption in this second, less legitimized tradition is of an asset rather than a deficit model, whereby medicine aims at so much more than the medicating of a disorder or the correcting of a momentary malfunction. A modern branch of ancient Gnosticism, which holds that we all have a God within us just waiting to be let out, it seeks nothing short of the maximization, the efflorescence of human potential. In this respect, it actively celebrates the power of the body to represent the character, and even become the medium of the soul. In theory, you could leave your appointment not just cured, but enlightened. The trouble is that this alternative tradition plays into the hands of the witch doctor, the shaman, the faith healer, all those practitioners who, in place of the reassuring diploma, pot plant, and receptionist, acculture themselves with ethnic arcana, non-specific aromas and hypnotic auras, which serve to mystify the personage of said practitioner even more than the very enigmatic illness. If her authority is built into the relationship with the patient, it doesn't take much for a doctor, even unwittingly, to exploit it, especially when the desperation for a cure can anesthetize us, the patient, to those who purport to do the curing. What's worse, the mysterious cure might not only not cure us, but deal a terrible blow. You visit the acupuncturist to subtly realign your energy and end up with an infection from the needles. Faced with such a prospect, who wouldn't side with the old school, the one that's at least officially sentient? Actually, it's a moot point. Set aside for a moment the question of authority. Alternative practitioners may well preach all sorts of mysteries like chai or chakra, but is that any less pompous and self-serving than donning a white coat, deferring to the medical scriptures, and codifying ailments in ancient Greek? Both are means of mystifying the doctor's authority, and both therefore means of keeping us in awe before them, and making our visit to the doctor such a call on our faith. Even the orthodox tradition has long embraced techniques that confuse the opposition between health and harm. For since at least the discovery of penicillin, the notion of a doctor dispensing apparently noxious substances for beneficial effect has, even in the corridors of medical power, gained credence and forced attention onto what, bar the famous placebo effect, is possibly the most mysterious phenomenon of all, that what kills does indeed cure. In fact, long before Fleming's Eureka moment of 1928 regarding the curative powers of bacteria, an ambiguity had been signaled in the word pharmakon in Greek, which translates as both poison and cure. And the ambiguity carries through into such insalubrious English phrases as hair of the dog, that is, the cure for a hangover being a drink. The counterintuitive principle which applies to certain vaccines is that a little bit of what is bad for you can do you the world of good. The question then is how little is little. For whatever the mysteries, it seems clear that the human body presents a highly reactive environment, a site where a minimal difference in dosage can produce a maximal difference in results. Remedy tipping back over into poison, and where therefore the stakes are very low. On the other hand, get the prescription right, and you will experience what might genuinely be called a modern miracle. You also hold such miracles in your own hand, and for all the authority of doctors and their institutions, you have a say in getting well too. A moment ago, I mentioned the placebo effect, and more than anything else in medicine, this speaks to your potential as a person to heal thyself, and not through treatment, but belief. For a placebo is the pharmacological form taken by rhetoric, the power of persuasion literally encapsulated. To enter the doctor's surgery is to enter, as we've seen, not only a brightly lit clinical space of reason, rectitude, and remedy, but also a shadowy world of authority, imagination, and the irrational, where our emotions as much as our bodies are in play, and our vulnerability rises with each minute spent among the magazines in the waiting room. What you're waiting for in the waiting room is the precious relief that comes with knowledge, making the waiting a kind of blindness. And as our vulnerability rises, so our resistance to persuasion falls, meaning that we become more and more amenable to the effects of the placebo that the doctor may dispense. Which is no bad thing. When we swallow it, we're not just taking her word, but also convincing ourselves, and that means we don't in fact always need the doctor to supply it. The point of the placebo is that if we believe we'll get better, the chances are we will.